Okay, today we are going to cover the results and reactions of Reconstruction. So, last we talked, a part of the radical Republican plan for Reconstruction was to allow former slaves to be elected into government positions. As I mentioned before, by 1870, all former Confederate states had met the requirements to rejoin the Union. In rejoining the Union, they then had the ability to rebuild their governments at the state and local level. The 15th Amendment had allowed for all men now to be able to vote. While we're going to see there are issues that we run into with the 15th Amendment and actually seeing everybody have the ability to carry out their vote, in the beginning of Reconstruction, in some areas, the Republican Party is going to dominate at the state and local levels because they're going to receive more votes of the newly freed black men. The Republican Party is going to be seen as the champion for rights for African Americans, which helped them gain those votes. So you're going to see this is the reason why the radical Republican Party was able to take hold in Congress, because they were getting more votes from the new voters. During Reconstruction, there will be corruption throughout the South. Corruption comes in the form of people trying to take advantage of the situation. The first group of people we have are known as scalawags. This is going to be a name given to Republicans of the South that supported freedmen's rights. Southerners are not going to be excited about freedmen having rights. Okay, first of all, they're angry that they just lost all of the source of their free labor. Okay, and now they are not going to approve of Southerners supporting the rights of African Americans because they see them as traitors. They don't support the Southern way of life if they support freedmen's rights. You're also going to see Northerners trying to take advantage of the situation in the South. Southerners are not going to be welcoming to these newcomers from the North. They're going to label them carpetbaggers because at the time their suitcases were often made out of carpet that they would throw over their shoulder. Again, we're not that original. This term is going to be used to describe opportunists from the North or from the West moving to the South after the Civil War. These newcomers are going to be looking to buy up land that had been confiscated from these large plantation owners, these large farm owners, and buying that land and starting a new life. Also, at this time, you're going to see corruption in politics, where politicians were being bribed in exchange for loans and contracts for the railroads. Republicans in the North and the South are going to be in favor of economic expansion. In the form of the railroad. The railroad is going to have the advantage of providing jobs. We have to construct all of these tracks, and the rail lines are going to provide for quick and efficient transportation. That won't only be for goods of the North, but it's going to be for the good of the nation. And legislators are going to be in favor of the railroads, and bribes are going to push those railroads along as well. I don't want to make it sound like Reconstruction is all negative. There were some pretty terrible parts. The one of the short-term gains, and I mean very short-term, was the Freedmen's Bureau. This is going to be a government agency that was put together to help emancipated slaves by providing food, supplies, and helping connect these newly freed people with confiscated land so that they can start a life. I mean, they had never been freed before, they'd never owned land before. There had to be a government institution set up to help these people who were freed. Because to plop them in the United States and say, okay, you have your freedom now, that's not enough. We have to help them acclimate to a new lifestyle. But this organization is going to be met with corruption. The government is going to underfund the organization, and that's going to make it end in 1872. So while it is short-lived, the idea was great in the beginning. It just doesn't come to full fruition. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment granting and defining citizenship in 1868, and the 15th Amendment granting the right to vote to newly freedmen. These amendments are going to be short term gains, long term struggles. Amendments that were passed. While the rights are going to be formally awarded, the right to regulate the actual rights of former slaves is going to be left to the states, and these states are where you find the people who were running the show for slavery for so long. Those people just didn't go away. There's many people in the South that wished to bring back slavery. And when you give them the right to regulate the rights of African Americans, you're going to see problems. And one of the major problems that we see is segregation. Some successes and failures when it comes to Reconstruction. First, the Republican Party is going to fail to support women's rights. This is not just African American women, it's white women, it's all women. Republicans are going to say we can't put women's rights and freedmen's rights together. We're not going to be able to get both tasks accomplished. They believed that they would be able to take on the challenge of freedmen's rights, so that's what they stuck with. They thought that was the winning battle there. Women are going to start to see more of an opportunity outside the home, especially in the industrial north, and that's going to create a push for women's rights. Seeing that freedmen have this opportunity, women are going to say, well, when is it our turn? So now all men have these rights, but what about women? The New South is going to come out of Reconstruction. The New South is going to develop a public school system. And this is going to be a very expensive part of Reconstruction that was mandated. And the reason it's so expensive is because Southerners are going to opt for segregating the public school system that was mandated in Reconstruction. And instead of just putting one school system in place for all children, they have a white school system and they have a black school system, and that just makes the whole process more expensive. So they did that to themselves. As if it's not expensive enough to implement a public school system, they chose to take on putting two in place when they were only mandated to have one. uh, you're also going to see legal protection, medical care, housing, and economic production all fall behind when compared to their northern and even western counterparts. So the South is not overall doing well, and a lot of it is because of what they were left with after the war. And you can see in that picture there, that's what a lot of the South looked like following the Civil War. Not only because of Sherman's march to sea, but because of where a lot of the battles were fought. The South is going to face heavy destruction, so they're going to have an expensive rebuild after the war. And there's not going to be a ton of money for them to work with because their economy is also taking a hit. So the South, an uphill battle all over the place. The end of Reconstruction is going to come with the election of 1876. Republicans are going to lose control over the House of Representatives in 1874 when Southern states start to elect former Confederate leaders back to Congress. Once the Southern states rejoined the Union, they got their ability to vote in representatives to the Senate and the House. And once the people start voting in the numbers that they had before and using voter intimidation to discourage the newly freedmen from exercising their right to vote, you're going to see the former Confederate leaders make their way back into Congress. In the election of 1876, you're going to have Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, facing off against Samuel Tilden, a Democrat. Both are going to be known for being tough on corruption, which appealed to the people. And because of their appeal to the people, we're going to see a very close race. Tilden is actually going to get 51% of the votes, but the Republicans claim that there was a miscount in 3 of the southern states, all of which were being carried by Tilden, and they demand a recount. Because of the dispute in the election, it's going to come down to the House of Representatives. And like I said, in 1874, the House had lost their Republican control. So when the Republicans go to pick between the Hayes, the Republican, and Tilden, the Democrat, a compromise is made. Because there was no clear presidential winner, the compromise of 1877 is going to leave the House of Representatives to choose the president. The deal that is made here is that Hayes, the Republican, will be selected as president. But the Republicans had to promise that they would remove federal troops from the South. They also had to promise that a cabinet position would be promised to a Southerner. And they had to promise federal aid to the South for railroad construction and ports. Now, this is important because Reconstruction plans were expensive for taxpayers, and that united Southern Republicans and Democrats in agreeing that uh, racial segregation would dominate the South, that they were against this idea of pushing forward with Reconstruction. So everybody wanted it to end. And the Compromise of 1877, choosing Hayes, a Republican, for the presidency with these promises in place, is going to push for the end of Reconstruction. And the problem here is that the goals of Reconstruction are forgotten. Republicans are going to be more invested with pushing forward industry in the North than they are with securing and protecting African American rights. So while Reconstruction sounded like a great idea in its origination, it kind of trickles off, and the Compromise of 1877 is going to leave a lot of loose ends for Reconstruction. Now we need to get to the Southern reaction to Reconstruction, because it was not all rainbows and butterflies in the South. The first reaction that we need to talk about is black codes. Because states were given the power to design laws to handle freedmen, you're going to see the South take advantage of that right. The powers that the states had in creating laws led them to create black codes. Black codes were passed as restrictive laws to deny freed blacks their freedoms. Um, what we're going to see is in the mid 1860s, Mississippi and South Carolina are going to enact the first black codes. Mississippi's law is going to require blacks to have written evidence of employment. And if they did not have that contract, they would be forced to forfeit earlier wages and could be arrested. In South Carolina, there is going to be a law passed that prohibits any African American from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant, unless they paid an annual tax of $10 to $100. This provision is going to hit free blacks already living in Charleston and former slave artisans especially hard. In both states, blacks were given heavy penalties for going against any of these black codes, including forced plantation labor in some cases. So, what these black codes essentially do with these labor contracts is ensure the availability of freed blacks to go back to the plantation, because the South is trying to solve their labor problem. And when given the ability to pass laws, they do it in such a way that funnels the newly freed blacks back onto the plantation. That was their whole goal, and the Reconstruction plans let that happen. Voting in the South. The 15th Amendment gives emancipated slaves the right to vote, okay? All men now have the right to vote. Southern states don't want that to happen. So, what they do is they pass laws, they pass taxes to prevent this right to vote to be carried out. The first thing, and I need you to put these all in your brain because they're very important. The first piece is poll taxes. This required a tax to be paid before someone could vote. And this might shock you, but it doesn't shock me. This is going to be used until 1964. People in areas throughout the South are going to have to pay to vote. I know, crazy. Literacy tests are also going to be put into place. You've heard of literacy tests before. Maybe you've even taken some literacy tests throughout elementary and middle school. This is a reading test. And what you had to do was be able to read an excerpt that was given to you before you could vote. Now, you might think, okay, well, that's not so bad. But some of these excerpts were from the Constitution, they were legal codes, they were things that even an educated person cannot read and evaluate successfully. Okay? So they made it impossible for the 15th Amendment right to be exercised in voting. But what they didn't anticipate were poll taxes and literacy tests also excluded poor, illiterate whites from voting. So the South had to go back to the drawing board and say, what could we do that would just exclude emancipated slaves from voting? And what they came up with was the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause is exactly what it sounds like. If your ancestors voted, you could vote. This would allow all whites, all white males, to vote, but no freed slaves could vote. And for generations, this would prevent them from voting. To further show how the South reacted to Reconstruction is the Jim Crow laws that were put into place. Again, the states were given the option to pass their own laws to regulate the rights of freedmen. And they do this, they pass these laws that hinder the rights of freedmen. Jim Crow laws are going to be establishing segregation under the disguise of everything is separate but equal. We'll have separate schoolhouses, we'll have separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate parts of town, and everything will be equal. It was meant to control formerly enslaved people and put them at a disadvantage. You can see from the pictures there, these are two different schoolhouses. Remember I said the South had to implement a public school system. The top would be a white public schoolhouse. The bottom would be a black public schoolhouse. So you can see they are anything but equal. Black codes and Jim Crow laws are going to be put into place to restrict freedmen from exercising their rights. And these laws are going to be enforced by former Confederate soldiers working in the police departments, making anybody who wanted to challenge these laws it impossible to do so. They're enforcing these codes. The prison system often issued harsher sentences on black offenders who went against Jim Crow laws and black codes. Jim Crow laws is going to create separate schools, public facilities, hotels, restaurants, eventually movie theaters, drinking fountains, everything. You're going to see these carried into the 60s and 70s. They're going to be around for a century, okay? 100 years they're going to be around. And the name Jim Crow comes from a blackface play that was very racist, a character better out of that. So again, picking at these people who have already suffered enough and they can't even exercise their rights. There are going to be a couple different stances on how to go against Jim Crow laws. The most notable leaders against Jim Crow, the first is going to be Booker T. Washington. Washington was a former slave who is going to believe that an industrial education is what will allow for freedmen to be successful. He's going to preach that we should have an acceptance of segregation, and that's the best way to combat the treatment of black codes and Jim Crow. Not that we should accept the terrible treatment, but that there should be an acceptance that this is the way that life is. All you can do is better yourself to better the next generation. So Washington is going to believe in an education and finding success in your own path in the individual. He is going to found the Tuskegee Institute, which is a black institute in Alabama that trains teachers. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to be the other notable leader against Jim Crow. He is going to be born in Massachusetts to a free black family in an integrated community. So you can already see that the two backgrounds of these men are different. Washington coming from a background as a former slave, and Du Bois being from an integrated community of a free black family. Du Bois is going to argue that an education and demanding for civil rights was the only route to equality. So he says, yes, an education is important, but we also have to fight for our rights. He is going to be the founder of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an association that will be extremely notable throughout the civil rights struggle over the next 100 years. And I say that 100 years. The next time we come together, we are going to tackle the issues within the New South as well as the effects of the war on the United States and wrap up Unit 5. Don't forget to do your homework for tonight and contact me with any questions.